They told me I had nothing. 2 years later, I held a piece of paper that proved the land, all 70 acres of it, had carried my name since before I was old enough to understand what a name could hold. But this story does not begin with that piece of paper. It does not begin with the lawyer's office, or the train ride, or the moment my sister and I stood on the porch of our own house and said the words that changed everything. No, this story begins with dirt, with the smell of it after rain, rich and dark and alive, the kind of smell that gets into your blood and stays there so that years later, in a cramped room above a laundry, in a town that never wanted you, you can close your eyes and be standing in a field again, barefoot, the cool earth pressing up between your toes, and for just a moment, you are home. It begins with my grandfather's hands. His name was Samuel Wallace, and he was the third generation of Wallaces to work that land in the hills of East Tennessee. 70 acres of it spread across the rolling country east of the Clinch River, where the Great Smoky Mountains sent their last low ridges out like fingers reaching for the valley floor. The northern edge was thick with white pine, tall and straight, their needles whispering in a language I believed as a child only my grandfather could understand. The western side opened into pasture, good grass country where the cattle grazed in the long light of summer evenings. A creek cut through the middle of the property, running cold and clear over smooth stones, and beside it stood a row of cottonwood trees that turned a living fire every October. The house sat on a gentle rise near the center of it all, a two-story structure of hewn timber with a deep porch that wrapped around three sides. From that porch, you could see nearly every corner of the land. My grandfather would stand there in the early mornings before the sun crested the ridge, a cup of coffee in his hand, his eyes moving slowly across the fields and fences and tree lines, reading the property the way some men read a newspaper. He was 68 years old the year I am telling you about, the year everything changed. His hair had gone white and his back had begun to curve at the shoulders from decades of labor. But his stride was still long and deliberate, and his grip on a fence post or a plow handle was still the grip of a man who understood that the earth does not give anything to those who hold it loosely. My name is Clara Wallace. My sister Emmeline, we called her Emmy, and I were born in the spring of 1900, twins, though you would not have known it to look at us. I was taller, darker-haired, with our father's sharp jaw and a habit of watching people a beat too long before I spoke. Emmy was softer, quieter, with our mother's round face and pale eyes that seemed to take in everything without needing to comment on it. We were 3 years old when our parents died. A logging wagon lost its brake on a mountain road. The horse panicked, the wagon overturned, and just like that, the world rearranged itself. Our father was Samuel's only son. Our mother was a schoolteacher's daughter from the next county. They were buried side by side in the small cemetery at the edge of the property under a dogwood tree that bloomed white every April. And our grandfather, without a word of complaint or self-pity, took us in and raised us as his own. He was not a man of many words. His lessons came in the form of weight and weather. He taught us the heft of a full milk pail carried in both hands through the blue half-light of dawn, the particular ache in the shoulders that meant the firewood was split and stacked for the week. He taught us how to read the sky, not from books, from standing in the open and watching. The way the clouds gathered low and took on a bruised purple color before a storm. The way the wind shifted direction and changed its pitch when it carried the first promise of snow down from the high ridges. He never sat us down to explain. He never drew diagrams or gave lectures. He simply did the work, and we followed. Emmeline and I, we were his shadows. Where he went, we went, our small legs pumping to keep pace with his long stride. We watched him run a line of fence, his movements economical and precise, the post driver rising and falling with a rhythm so steady it sounded like a heartbeat. We watched him, gentle, a nervous filly, his voice dropping to a murmur so low it was almost a hum, his hand resting on her neck, patient and still, until her trembling stopped and she leaned into him. He would let us help in small ways, our clumsy hands working alongside his sure ones. Emmy scattered feed for the chickens each morning, and their frantic, joyful clucking was the sound that meant the day had begun. I pulled weeds from the vegetable garden, the sun burning the back of my neck, my fingers stained green by the end of each row. The land was not an idea to us. It was not a concept or an asset or a line on a map. It was a physical thing as real as our own bodies. It was the sharp, clean smell of the pines at the northern edge on a cold morning. It was the soft, giving mud along the creek bank where we caught crawfish in the summer. It was the hard-baked clay of the yard in August, cracked and pale under the relentless sun. It was the taste of the first wild strawberries that grew along the old stone wall, small and intensely sweet, so different from anything you could buy in a store that they seemed to belong to a different category of food altogether. And my grandfather was part of it, inseparable from it, like one of those old oak trees whose roots run so deep and so wide that they hold the whole hillside together. He never once said the words, "This will be yours someday." He never spoke of the future at all. He just showed us the work. And the work we came to understand was the thing that lasted. I was 14 the night I saw him doing something I did not understand. I had woken past midnight thirsty and padded barefoot down the stairs to the kitchen. A line of yellow light was showing under the door of his study, the small room at the back of the house where he kept his ledgers and his almanacs and a wooden filing cabinet that he always kept locked. I pushed the door open quietly. He was sitting at his desk, papers spread before him, writing with a concentration I had never seen in him before. This was not the easy, familiar focus of a man mending a harness or sharpening a blade. This was something else, something careful and deliberate, and I thought a little desperate. He looked up when the door creaked, but he did not startle. He just looked at me with those deep-set eyes, tired but steady, and a small, weary smile crossed his face. "What are you doing up so late, Grandpa?" He set down his pen. "I am planting a different kind of seed, child. The kind that grows slow, but once it takes root, nobody can pull it up." I did not understand. I stood there in my nightgown, my bare feet cold on the wooden floor, waiting for him to explain. But he only looked at me for a long moment, as if he were memorizing my face, and then he said something I would carry with me for years without knowing its weight. "The land never forgets the ones who loved it. Remember that, Clara, no matter what happens." Then he told me gently to go back to bed. I did. I lay in the dark beside Emmy, listening to her slow, even breathing, turning his words over in my mind like smooth stones. I did not know what he meant. I would not know for a long time. There was one other thing, a small thing or so I thought at the time. Emmy told me once in the offhand way, children share secrets they do not know, are secrets that she had seen Grandpa digging under the front porch steps late one night. She had been unable to sleep and had gone to the window, and there he was in the moonlight on his knees in the dirt, placing something into a hole beneath the third step from the bottom. When she asked him about it the next morning, he laughed and told her she had been dreaming. I believed him. Emmy, I think, did not. But she let it go the way children let go of things they are not yet ready to hold. The autumn of 1917 came in slowly, the way autumn does in East Tennessee, the hills changing color from the top down, the highest ridges going first, then the slopes, then the valleys, until the whole world seemed lit from within. The cottonwoods along the creek turned a fierce, brittle gold. The air carried the smell of wood smoke and fallen leaves and something else, something final like the last page of a book being turned. Grandpa Samuel had been slowing down, not dramatically, not in the way that announces itself. Just a heaviness in his step that had not been there before, a cough that lingered too long in the evenings, a tendency to sit down on the porch after a morning's work and rest his hands on his knees, breathing carefully, as if the air had become something he had to negotiate with rather than simply take. But he still went out every morning. He still walked the fence line. He still checked the cattle and inspected the garden and stood on the porch at dawn with his coffee reading the land. One week before the end, he called me out to the porch in the late afternoon. The sun was low, throwing long shadows across the pasture, and the air had that particular stillness that comes just before evening when the birds have gone quiet and the world seems to be holding its breath. He was sitting in the old rocking chair, the one he had built himself from hickory wood, and he did not look at me when I came out. He was looking at the fields. I sat down on the step beside him and waited. With Grandpa, you learn to wait. Words came when they were ready and not before. "Everything I have done," he said finally, his voice low and rough like gravel turning in a creek bed, "I have done for you too. Whatever happens, Clara, remember that." I wanted to ask what he meant. I wanted to ask why he said whatever happens, as if something was coming, something he could see that I could not. But he had already risen from the chair slowly with the careful movements of a man who knows his body is no longer his ally. And he laid his hand on my shoulder just for a moment, a brief, firm pressure, and then he walked inside. That was our last conversation. He died in his sleep on a Wednesday morning in late October 1917. I found him when I went to wake him for breakfast. His face was peaceful and his hands were folded across his chest. And for one strange, suspended moment, I thought he was simply resting the way he sometimes rested in the afternoon, lying very still with his eyes closed, listening to the sounds of the farm. But his skin was cool, and the room was too quiet, and I knew. The silence that followed was unlike any silence I had known. It was not the comfortable quiet of a house at rest. It was the hollow, ringing emptiness of a house that has lost its center. Emmy and I moved through the rooms like sleepwalkers, our footsteps too loud on the wooden floors, our voices, when we spoke at all, sounding thin and foreign in the still air. Emmy cried through the night. I did not cry. I was too stunned for tears, and somewhere in the numb core of my grief, I felt the weight of a new and unfamiliar obligation. I had to be strong. For Emmy, for us both. I did not yet know how impossible that would turn out to be. They came 3 days after the funeral. The buggy appeared at the far end of our lane on a Tuesday afternoon, clean and polished, grotesquely out of place on the dusty farm road. Two figures sat in the back dressed in city black, their outlines sharp against the soft greens and faded browns of the autumn landscape. Our Aunt Dorothea and her husband, Franklin Prescott. Dorothea was my grandfather's only daughter, older than our father by 6 years. She had left the farm as a young woman, married Franklin Prescott, a land speculator from Knoxville, and moved to the city with an eagerness that suggested she was not leaving something behind so much as escaping it. She visited rarely. Every visit I could remember had ended in raised voices behind closed doors. I had been 14 the last time she came, 2 years before Grandpa died. I had been sitting on the back stairs shelling peas when I heard them through the kitchen window. Dorothea's voice was high and tight, vibrating with a grievance that seemed too large for the room to hold. You spend everything on those two children, while your own daughter struggles in the city. Franklin's business needs capital, father. Sell the back 40, sell the timber rights. Do something. And Grandpa's voice, flat and cold, a voice I had never heard him use with anyone else. This land is not for sale. Not the back 40, not a single acre. It is the backbone of this family, and I will not break it, so your husband can throw money at another one of his schemes. You always choose this dirt over your own daughter. The door slammed, the buggy left. The chickens in the yard scattered and regrouped and went back to pecking at the ground, and the farm absorbed the disturbance the way the land absorbs a brief violent rain without comment, without lasting change. But I remembered. I remembered the sound of Dorothea's voice, the particular poison in the word dirt. And I remembered the look on my grandfather's face when he came back to the porch, a look of sadness so deep it frightened me, the sadness of a man who has lost something he knows he will never get back. Now she was here again. She walked into the kitchen without knocking, without removing her gloves, without embracing her nieces, who stood by the cold stove with hollow eyes and unwashed hair. She moved through the room the way a buyer moves through a property, assessing surfaces, calculating value. Her gloved finger traced the edge of the wooden countertop. She looked at the stove, the shelves, the floor. She did not weep. She assessed. Franklin came in behind her, a tall, stooped man with narrow shoulders and eyes that seemed to see the world exclusively in terms of numbers. He carried a small leather notebook and a pencil, and before he had been in the house 5 minutes, I saw him standing on the back porch, his gaze sweeping across the fields to the west, his pencil moving in quick, precise strokes. He was not admiring the view. He was estimating acreage. He was calculating value per acre. He was doing arithmetic with my grandfather's life's work before the flowers on the grave had wilted. That evening, we sat at the kitchen table for the first time since Grandpa's death. Dorothea took the chair at the head of the table. His chair. I felt the blood rise in my face, felt my fingers curl into fists under the table, but I said nothing. Not yet. Franklin spoke first in the clipped, businesslike tone of a man accustomed to discussing transactions. He talked about rationalizing the estate, about settling obligations, about the most efficient disposition of assets. He might have been discussing a warehouse inventory. Dorothea let him finish, then turned to us, her voice thin and dry like the husk of last year's corn. Your grandfather was a sentimental man, but sentiment does not pay bills. The house, the land, all of it falls to us now. There is a will. It has been filed with the county. The debts are not small. She looked at us, then a quick dismissive glance, the kind of look you give to objects in a room that you have already decided to discard. There is nothing here for you. I spoke before I could stop myself, my voice steadier than I expected. Grandpa never told us any of that. He always said this land belonged to the family. Dorothea's eyes narrowed. I am the family child. I am his daughter, his only surviving child. Emmy beside me whispered the words that were too heavy for a whisper. But this is our home. Franklin cut her off, not cruelly, just with the finality of a door closing on a room you will never enter again. This is our home now. The law is the law. After supper, I watched Dorothea go to the door of Grandpa's study. She produced a key I had never seen, turned it in. The lock stepped inside for a brief moment, then came out, pulled the door shut, and locked it again. She slipped the key into her pocket and walked away without a word. Why did she lock that room? What was she looking for? What was she afraid someone might find? The questions burned in me, but I had no time to pursue them. Because the next morning our exile began. Dorothea placed 2 canvas bags on the kitchen table at first light. 1 bag each, clothing only. The town of Millhaven has a boarding house. You are old enough to work. I stared at the bags. I stared at her. I searched her face for something, some flicker of guilt, some shadow of the family bond that should have made this moment impossible. There was nothing. Her face was a closed ledger. Where will we go? I asked, and I hated the smallness of my own voice. I have told you, Millhaven. There is a laundry that hires girls. You will manage. I turned and ran upstairs, not to pack, but to try one last thing. I went to Grandpa's study and grabbed the door handle. Locked. I pulled, I twisted, I threw my weight against it. The old wood did not budge. Franklin's voice came from behind me, calm and cold as creek water in January. Do not do anything foolish, girl. I can send for the sheriff if I need to. I let go of the handle. I let go of the last physical connection to whatever my grandfather had been writing that night, whatever seeds he had been planting in paper and ink. I let go, and I walked to our room, and I packed. 1 bag each. I folded my 2 dresses, my spare stockings, my work boots, and then I took one thing that was not clothing. From the bedside table, I picked up Grandpa's handkerchief, the one he always carried in his breast pocket, white cotton with his initials embroidered in blue thread. S.W. Samuel Wallace. I pressed it to my face and breathed in the last ghost of his scent, cedar and pipe tobacco, and the clean smell of outdoor air, and I put it in my bag. Across the room, Emmy was folding her things with trembling hands. I saw her slip something small into her pocket, a dried chestnut, the kind Grandpa always carried in his coat, turning it over and over in his fingers as he walked the property, a habit so familiar it was part of him, like his long stride or his quiet laugh. We walked down the lane together, my sister and I. The morning was cool and clear, the kind of perfect autumn morning that Grandpa would have called a gift. A hired buggy waited at the end of the road, the driver a stranger who did not look at us. I took Emmy's hand and held it so tightly my knuckles went white. She was crying, but silently, the tears running down her dusty cheeks without sound, as if even her grief was afraid to make itself heard in this new world, where we no longer had a right to anything, not even noise. I did not cry. I swallowed the tears the way you swallow something sharp, feeling it cut all the way down, and I whispered to her the only words I had. We will be all right. I did not believe them. As the buggy lurched forward and the wheels began to turn, I looked back. Just once. I did not mean to. My body turned of its own accord, some reflex deeper than thought, and I saw the house receding behind us. The porch, the yard, the barn, the fields stretching out on either side, the dark line of pines to the north, the whole 70 acres of our world shrinking in the distance. And on the porch I saw Franklin Prescott. He was standing at the railing, his leather notebook in his hand, his eyes narrowed, looking not at us, but at the western pasture. His lips moving slightly as he calculated, estimated, appraised. He was putting a price on the land before the dust from our departure had settled. That image burned itself into my memory with the permanence of a brand on cattle hide. The man with the notebook. The man who could look at 70 acres of another man's love and see only a number. I turned back around and faced the road ahead. The buggy carried us toward Millhaven, toward a life we had not chosen and could not yet imagine. And behind us, growing smaller with every turn of the wheels, was everything we had ever known. I did not know as we rode away that in a town 50 miles to the west, in the locked filing cabinet of a quiet law office, there was a thick sheaf of documents with my name on them. Clara Wallace, Emmeline Wallace, written in my grandfather's hand, witnessed and notarized and filed according to the full force of the law. And I did not know that Franklin Prescott, the man with the notebook, was already looking for a way to destroy them before we ever learned they existed. The town of Millhaven was a place built for function, not for comfort, and certainly not for two girls who had spent their entire lives measuring the world by the distance between a creek and a tree line. It sat at the junction of two rail lines in a shallow valley, a grid of narrow streets and clapboard buildings pressed together as if the town itself were afraid of the open country surrounding it. The air smelled of coal smoke and lye, and the hot, metallic breath of the blacksmith's forge on 3rd Street. The sounds were different too. Not the layered living quiet of the farm where silence was never truly silent, but filled with the rustle of wind through grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Here the noise was mechanical and abrupt. The shriek of the train whistle at 6 in the morning and again at 9 at night. The clatter of wagon wheels on packed dirt. The voices of strangers, hundreds of them moving past each other on the sidewalks without recognition or interest, each one sealed inside the small private country of their own concerns. Ida Crenshaw's boarding house stood on Maple Street, a 3-story wooden structure with paint that had once been yellow and was now the color of old bone. The stairs groaned under our feet as Mrs. Crenshaw led us up to the top floor, a narrow room tucked beneath the eaves with a sloped ceiling that made you duck if you stood too close to the walls. There was one window. It faced a brick wall the side of the hardware store next door, close enough that you could have reached out and touched it if the glass had not been in the way. But if you pressed your cheek flat against the pane and craned your neck hard to the left, you could see a sliver of sky, a thin, pale strip of gray or blue, depending on the weather caught between the roof lines. That sliver became our horizon. That sliver became our 70 acres. Mrs. Crenshaw was a woman who had been carved down to essentials by a life that had offered her very little padding. She was perhaps 60, with deep lines bracketing her mouth and eyes that were the color of slate, sharp and flat, and giving nothing away. She stated her terms at the door without preamble. Rent due on the 1st, no noise after 9, no cooking in the room, no exceptions, no extensions, no sentiment. She looked at us the way a carpenter looks at lumber, gauging whether we were sound enough to bear weight, and then she left us there with the thin mattress and the brick wall view and the smell of someone else's old life soaked into the floorboards. We found work on the 3rd day. Harlan Briggs ran the only commercial laundry in Millhaven, a long, low building on the south side of town, where the steam rose from the vents in thick white columns that you could see from 3 blocks away. Briggs was a man of about 45, heavy in the middle, with a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and a habit of chewing tobacco that left a permanent brown stain at the corner of his mouth. He had small eyes set deep in fleshy sockets, and they moved constantly, tracking his workers the way a barn cat tracks mice. Not with malice exactly, but with a predatory patience that made clear he considered everything in his establishment, including the people, to be his property. He looked at our hands when we came in, not our faces. Our hands, the calluses, the roughness, the evidence of years of physical work. He nodded, satisfied. $3 a week each, 6 in the morning to 6 at night, half-day Sunday. You start tomorrow. The work was brutal. There is no other word for it. The laundry was a kingdom of steam and scalding water and the harsh, acrid bite of lye soap that ate into your skin like acid. We stood for 12 hours at the washing tubs, our arms plunged to the elbows in water so hot it turned our skin an angry mottled red that faded each night only to return each morning. The air was thick and wet, a suffocating fog that tasted of chemicals and other people's sweat. And by the end of each day, our dresses were soaked through, and our backs ached with a dull, grinding pain that sleep could only partially erase. Emmy burned her hand badly in the 2nd week, a splash of boiling water that raised a blister across her palm the size of a silver dollar. She showed it to Briggs, who glanced at it the way you glance at a clock and said, "Your other hand still works." We endured. That is the most precise word for what we did in those first months. We did not live. We did not grow. We endured the way a fence post endures a winter standing in place because there is nowhere else to go bearing the weight, because the alternative is to fall. We saved every penny we could spare, hoarding coins in a small tin box that we hid under a loose floorboard in our room. We ate as little as possible. We spoke even less. Emmy was fading. I could see it happening the way you can see a candle burning down slowly, steadily, the flame still there but smaller each day, consuming itself. She would stand at our window for long stretches, her forehead against the glass, her eyes fixed on the brick wall as if she were trying to see through it, past it, to the green and open country that existed now only in memory. She barely spoke. When she did, her voice had a thin, breakable quality like a wire pulled too taut. She was not weak. What she was, I think, was something more dangerous. She was losing the thing inside her that believed the world had a place for her in it, and I did not know how to give it back. 4 months in, I discovered something that turned my grief into something harder and more useful. Anger. I had been keeping a careful record of our wages in a small notebook, the way Grandpa had taught me to keep track of feed costs and milk yields. Every day worked, every dollar owed, every penny received. The numbers did not add up. Briggs was paying us $2 a week, not $3. I went back through my records, counting and recounting, and the shortfall was consistent. He had been skimming a third of our wages from the very first week. I confronted him on a Thursday afternoon, standing in front of his desk in the small, cluttered office at the back of the laundry. My hands were still wet from the washing tubs, and I could feel the soap burns stinging in the creases of my fingers. I held my notebook open in front of him. "You are paying us $2 instead of $3, every week since we started." Briggs leaned back in his chair and looked at me the way a large dog looks at a small one that has wandered too close to its food bowl. Amused, unimpressed. He spat tobacco juice into the tin can at his feet and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Deductions," he said. "Soap costs, lunch provision, breakage." He ticked the items off on his thick fingers as if reciting a well-rehearsed list. "We bring our own lunch. We have never broken anything. And the soap is your cost of doing business, not ours." His amusement disappeared. He leaned forward and his voice dropped to something low and flat, a voice designed to end conversations. "Let me explain something to you, girl. You are two orphans with no family, no references, no connections, and nobody in this town who knows your name or cares whether you wake up tomorrow. You want to take your complaint to the sheriff, go ahead. See how far two no-name girls get against a tax-paying businessman. You do not like the terms, there is the door." I stood there for a long moment, my notebook in my hand, the numbers staring up at me in my own careful handwriting. Proof of theft. Proof that meant nothing in a world where proof required power to enforce it. I thought of Grandpa, of the night I had found him in his study, writing by lamplight, planting seeds in paper and ink. He had understood something I was only beginning to learn, that the truth without the machinery to make it heard is just a sound in an empty room. I went back to the washing tubs. I did not quit. I did not cry. I kept the notebook. I kept the records. And I waited without knowing what I was waiting for, the way a seed waits in frozen ground. Ida Crenshaw had been watching us since the day we moved in, though I did not realize it at first. She was not a woman who announced her observations. She collected them the way some people collect stamps, quietly and with great attention to detail. She noticed that I washed our clothes by hand at midnight to save the cost of the commercial laundry. She noticed that Emmy ate less and less each week, pushing food around her plate, her appetite shrinking along with her voice. She noticed the rawness of our hands, the way we moved stiffly each evening when we came home, the careful, measured way I counted our coins each Sunday, arranging them in small piles on the bed, doing the arithmetic of survival. One evening in our 5th month, she knocked on our door and set a plate of cornbread and a jar of fresh milk on the narrow table by the window. "I cannot abide waste," she said, her voice flat, her face giving nothing away. "This was left from supper. Eat it, or I will throw it out." She was gone before I could respond. The visits became a rhythm, not regular enough to be predictable, but frequent enough to matter. A pot of bean soup left on our landing. A pair of wool stockings draped over our doorknob with no note, no explanation. A quiet reduction in our rent that appeared on the monthly ledger without comment. She never spoke of charity. She never used the word kindness. She simply rearranged the facts of our existence, one small adjustment at a time, and dared us to mention it. It was a night in deep winter January, the cold pressing against the window pane, when she sat down across from me in the boarding house kitchen and poured 2 cups of tea from a chipped blue pot. Emmy was upstairs asleep. The house was quiet. Ida Crenshaw looked at me over the rim of her cup, and for the first time since I had known her, something behind those slate-colored eyes shifted. "I lost a home once," she said, 30 years ago. Husband died of pneumonia, and his brother came the next week with a lawyer and a deed and took the farm out from under me. I was 29 years old with $2 in my pocket and a town full of people who looked straight through me. She took a sip of tea. I built this boarding house with my own hands. Every board, every nail. Took me 7 years. She did not say anything else. She did not tell me what lesson I was supposed to draw from her story. She just drank her tea and went to bed, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the cold and the quiet and the strange, fragile feeling that someone in this town saw me. Not past me, not through me, me. Around the 10th month, I saw something that made the hair rise on the back of my neck. I was wringing out a bedsheet at the laundry, my arms trembling with fatigue when the mail carrier came through the door and handed Briggs an envelope. I would not have noticed except for one thing. The postmark. I could read it clearly from where I stood, the name of our home county in East Tennessee, printed in smudged black ink on the upper corner. Briggs read the letter quickly, his lips moving slightly, and then he looked up and his eyes found me across the room. He held my gaze for a long moment, 3 seconds, maybe 4, and there was something in that look I had never seen before. Not the usual contempt, not the irritation of an employer watching a slow worker. It was the look of a man who has just received a piece of information and is calculating its value. He folded the letter, slid it into his vest pocket, and went back to his ledger without a word. I did not know then what that letter contained. I did not know that Franklin Prescott had written to his old acquaintance Harlan Briggs, asking a simple question with an answer that was worth 70 acres of Tennessee hill country. Are the girls still there? Are they still alive? Briggs had written back, yes. The winter deepened. February 1918, the coldest month in a decade. Ice on the inside of our window pane, frost on the floorboards in the morning. And then Emmy got sick. It started with a dry cough that she tried to hide, pressing her fist against her mouth, turning away so I would not see. Then the fever came sudden and savage, burning through her body the way a grass fire burns through dry pasture. By the 2nd day, she could not stand. By the 3rd day, she was delirious, her skin so hot it hurt to touch the sheets soaked through with sweat that smelled of sickness and something worse, something sour and deep that I recognized from the farm, from animals that were losing a fight their bodies could not win. I had no money for a doctor. I had 16 cents in the tin box and a debt to Briggs for wages not yet paid. I sat on the edge of Emmy's bed, wringing out a cold cloth in a basin of water I had carried up 3 flights of stairs, and I felt the ground beneath me give way. Not the physical ground, something deeper. The place inside you where you store the belief that things will work out, that the universe, however cruel, operates according to some basic principle of fairness. That place crumbled, and in its absence was nothing, just a vast cold space, empty of hope and reason and faith. Ida Crenshaw came through the door without knocking. She took one look at Emmy, pressed her palm to her forehead, and her face went tight. This is bad. I have seen fevers like this take grown men in 3 days. For 3 nights we fought for Emmy's life. Ida taught me to brew a tea from dried elderflower and willow bark, bitter and sharp, that we spooned between Emmy's cracked lips every hour. She showed me how to pack damp cloths around Emmy's neck and wrists to draw the heat out, and she sat with me through the darkest hours, the small room lit by a single candle, the only sounds Emmy's ragged breathing and the wind against the window. We did not talk much. There was nothing to say. We simply worked, the two of us side by side, doing the only thing that could be done, which was to refuse to let go. On the 2nd night, Emmy spoke through the fever. Her eyes were open but unseeing, fixed on something beyond the ceiling, beyond the room, beyond the world of brick walls and steam and lie. Her voice was small and clear, stripped of everything but raw memory. Grandpa, I can see the box under the porch steps. What did you put in there? I went cold. The words hit me with a physical force, reaching back through the years to that conversation Emmy as a child, telling me she had seen our grandfather digging beneath the porch by moonlight. I had dismissed it then. I could not dismiss it now, but I had no space in my mind for mysteries. My sister was dying. Everything else would have to wait. The 3rd night was the worst. Emmy stopped sweating. Her skin turned cool and dry, papery, and her breathing became so shallow I had to lean close to her mouth to feel it. I gathered her into my arms, her body light and fragile, and I held her against my chest, rocking gently the way Grandpa used to rock on the porch in his hickory chair. And I cried. For the first time since we left the farm, I cried. The tears came without permission, without sound, flooding down my face and into Emmy's hair, and I whispered to her the only promise I had left. You are not going to die. You are not going to leave me here alone. I am going to take you home. I swear it. I did not know where home was anymore. I did not know if it still existed. I only knew that the word itself was the strongest thing I had, and I gave it to her like medicine, repeating it until my voice gave out. By dawn, the fever broke. Emmy opened her eyes, truly opened them, and looked at me, and I saw recognition there, and confusion, and a terrible bottomless exhaustion. "Clara," she whispered, "I am thirsty." I poured water with shaking hands and held the cup to her lips, and Ida Crenshaw, standing in the doorway, let out a long breath that she might have been holding for 3 days. Emmy survived, but recovery was slow. 6 weeks before she could stand without help, 8 before she could walk the length of the hallway. During those weeks, I worked double shifts at the laundry, my body operating on reserves I did not know it possessed. Briggs docked our pay further, citing reduced output, and I took it without argument, because argument required energy I had already spent. I was running on fumes and stubbornness and the memory of a promise made in the dark. When Emmy was finally well enough to sit up in bed and eat solid food, I checked the tin box. Nearly empty. The illness had consumed almost everything we had saved in 14 months of labor. I sat by the window that evening watching the light fade behind the brick wall, and I thought seriously for the first time about giving up. Not dying, nothing so dramatic. Just accepting, letting the farm go. Letting the memory of it become just that, a memory, something sweet and distant that belonged to a childhood that was over. I could find different work. A kitchen job at the hotel, maybe. Emmy could clerk in a shop once she was stronger. We could build something small and safe and permanent here in Millhaven, and the 70 acres could become someone else's problem, someone else's dream. Ida found me there staring at the wall, my hands empty in my lap. "You are thinking about quitting," she said. It was not a question. "Quitting what we have nothing to quit." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that I have carried with me every day since. "When you can say those words without it hurting, that is when you will truly have nothing. But you are still hurting, Clara. That means you still have something left." I did not answer her. That night I took Grandpa's handkerchief from my bag, pressed it against my chest, and lay in the dark, breathing in the last trace of a scent that was almost gone, trying to hold on to something I could not name. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in June 1919. A delivery boy knocked on the boarding house door, a freckled kid of about 12, who looked surprised that anyone lived in the attic room. The envelope was thick, made of heavy, expensive paper, the kind I had not touched since the documents in Grandpa's study. The return address read Whitfield and Associates Attorneys at Law, from a town called Granger, 50 miles to the west. It was addressed to both of us, Clara Wallace and Emmeline Wallace. My hands were shaking as I opened it. Emmy stood beside me, her shoulder touching mine. Her breath held tight. The language inside was dense with legal phrasing, words, and constructions I could barely parse, but certain phrases stood out from the rest with the clarity of lightning against a dark sky. The estate of Samuel Wallace. Assets held in trust. Final disposition. And one sentence buried in the middle of the second page that stopped my heart. Concerning 70 acres of land in your home county. We read the letter 3 times. Hope, when you have taught yourself to live without it, is not a comfort. It is a weapon pointed at your chest. It felt like a trap, a cruel joke engineered to reopen every wound we had spent 2 years learning to close. Emmy's eyes were wide, fixed on the page, her lips moving as she read the words again and again, as if repetition could change their meaning or confirm it. "What does it mean?" she whispered. "It means we have to go," I said. I took the letter to Ida Crenshaw. She read it slowly twice, her face giving nothing away until she reached the end. Then she looked up at me, and her expression was different from any I had seen on her before. Not the guarded blankness, not the gruff efficiency, something softer and fiercer at the same time. "This is real," she said. "This paper is expensive. Law offices do not send letters like this for sport." She folded it carefully and handed it back. "Go. Take every cent from the tin box. You owe me nothing for this month's rent." "I cannot take your money, Mrs. Crenshaw." "You are not taking my money. You are taking your future. There is a difference. Now stop being foolish and pack your bag." We spent nearly everything we had on 2 train tickets. The journey took most of a day, the landscape outside the window changing mile by mile, from the cramped geometry of town to the rolling open country of the Tennessee hills. And with every mile I felt something shift inside me, some frozen thing beginning to thaw painfully, the way feeling returns to a frostbitten hand. The law office of Whitfield and Associates occupied the second floor of a brick building on the main street of Granger. It smelled of old paper and furniture polish and the particular stillness of rooms where important things are kept waiting. Mr. Whitfield was a man of about 65 with white hair and spectacles, and the deliberate manner of someone who weighs each word before releasing it into the world. He did not rush us. He sat us down in two sturdy oak chairs, poured us each a glass of water, and let the silence settle the way sediment settles in a still pond. Then he began to speak, and with every sentence the world we had known for 2 years came apart at the seams. He told us about a plan, a quiet, meticulous strategy that our grandfather had put into motion years before his death. Samuel Wallace, he explained, had known his daughter. He had known her mind, which was quick with figures and slow with feeling. He had known her husband, whose talent for speculation was exceeded only by his talent for debt. And he had known with the clear-sighted certainty of a man who has spent a lifetime reading weather and soil in the hearts of those around him that they would try to take the land. So he had made two wills. The first, the one Dorothea and Franklin had found and filed with the county, left them the house and its contents along with a modest annuity. Enough to live on. Enough to make them believe they had inherited everything worth having. But there was a second document, a trust legally binding drawn up and witnessed and filed in a separate county where Dorothea would never think to look. And that trust contained the one thing Samuel Wallace had valued above all else. The land, Mr. Whitfield said, and he slid a thick document across the desk toward us. 70 acres. He never put a single acre of it in their names. He put it in yours. The room tilted. I gripped the arms of the chair and read the names on the deed written in black ink in a clerk's careful hand. Clara Wallace, Emmeline Wallace, sole and rightful owners. A young man appeared in the doorway. Thomas Aldridge, Whitfield's clerk, 25 years old, with an earnest face and a leather satchel full of documents. Whitfield introduced him quietly. Thomas is the man who found you, and he is the reason this trust still exists. Thomas told us what had nearly happened. 6 months ago, Franklin Prescott had walked into this very office and told Mr. Whitfield that the two beneficiaries of the Wallace Trust had disappeared, that they could not be located, that they were in all likelihood dead. He had brought a petition to dissolve the trust and transfer the land to the next of kin, meaning himself and Dorothea. Thomas had been in the room. Something about Franklin's manner, the smoothness of his story, the rehearsed quality of his grief, had struck a wrong note. I wrote to every boarding house, every employer, every postmaster in a 50-mile radius, Thomas said. I found your names in Mrs. Crenshaw's tenancy ledger 3 weeks before Prescott's petition was scheduled to go before a judge. 3 weeks. We had come within 3 weeks of losing everything without ever knowing we had anything to lose. Thomas confirmed something else. The letters from our home county that Briggs had received. Franklin had written to his old acquaintance, asking him to verify that the girls were still alive and still in Millhaven. Briggs had confirmed it. The man who had stolen our wages had also been reporting our whereabouts to the man who was trying to steal our land. Mr. Whitfield opened a locked drawer in his desk and withdrew a sealed envelope. The wax still unbroken, stamped with the impression of a signet ring I recognized. Grandpa's ring. The one with the small W engraved in the center. Your grandfather instructed me to give this to you only in person, only when you came to this office yourselves. I broke the seal. Inside was a letter handwritten, the ink faded to brown on paper that had yellowed with the years. I recognized the handwriting immediately, the strong, upright letters, the slight leftward slant, the way the T's were crossed with a single decisive stroke. I had seen it 1,000 times on feed orders and fence post tallies and the margins of almanacs. I read it aloud, my voice breaking on every other word, and Emmy stood beside me with tears running freely down her face, and Mr. Whitfield sat very still behind his desk, and Thomas Aldridge quietly left the room. He had known. Our grandfather had known everything that would happen, not the details, but the shape of it, the inevitable trajectory of his daughter's resentment and her husband's greed. He wrote that he could not prevent them from taking the house. He could not shield us from the years of hardship that would follow. To reveal the trust too early would have given them time to challenge it, to manipulate us, to find some legal mechanism to break it. We had to be 18. We had to be old enough to stand on our own. And then, near the bottom of the page, in letters that seemed to press harder into the paper, as if the pen itself were trying to make the words permanent, he had written this. I am not leaving you 70 acres of land. I am leaving you the meaning of 70 acres. The difference is everything. I folded the letter and held it against my chest over my heart, where Grandpa's handkerchief had rested so many nights in the dark. Emmy put her arm around my shoulders and leaned her head against mine, and we stood there in that quiet office. Two girls who had spent 2 years believing they had been abandoned by the one person who would never have abandoned them, and we understood at last the size and shape and patience of his love. We held the deed to 70 acres of land. Our names were on it in black ink. The law was on our side. But between us and that land stood two people who had built their lives on the assumption that it belonged to them. And I knew with a certainty that sat cold and heavy in my stomach that they would not surrender it quietly. We had the truth. We had the paper. Now we had to go home and face the people who had sent us away, and this time they were the ones who would have to leave. The train carried us east through country that grew greener and wilder with every mile, the flat farmland of the valley giving way to the first low hills, then the higher ridges beyond, furred with pine and poplar, and the dark heavy green of summer hardwoods. I sat with the deed in the inside pocket of my coat, my hand resting over it, the way a soldier rests his hand over a wound pressing down, holding something vital in place. Emmy sat across from me, her face turned to the window, and there was something in her expression I had not seen in 2 years. Not happiness, not yet. Something that came before happiness, the way the first gray light before sunrise is not the sun, but the proof that the sun is coming. Mr. Whitfield sat beside the window on my side, his leather case on his lap, his hands folded over it, with the stillness of a man who has learned that patience is not passive, but strategic. Thomas Aldridge was in the seat behind us, his satchel full of documents that could end a man's career and possibly his freedom. Between the four of us, we carried enough paper to redraw the boundaries of two lives. But paper, I was learning, was only the beginning. Paper told you who owned the land. It did not tell you what it would cost to stand on it and say the words out loud. Emmy spoke without turning from the window. It was the longest sentence she had put together in months, and her voice had a quality I did not recognize. Something low and steady like a note struck on a piano that continues to resonate after the finger has lifted. "Are you afraid, Clara?" "Yes." "Good, so am I. That means we still care enough to be afraid." I looked at her. She was still watching the hills roll past, but there was color in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the warmth of the train car, and her hands resting in her lap were not trembling. I thought of Ida Crenshaw's words about pain being proof that something remained, and I realized that Emmy had been listening too in her own way through walls and silence, and the thin membrane of fever absorbing strength from a source I had not noticed. We hired a buggy in Walden, the nearest town to our old property, from a livery stable run by a man who looked at the four of us, two young women in worn dresses and two men in lawyers' clothes, with undisguised curiosity, but no questions. The road to the farm was 7 miles of packed red clay winding through the hills. I knew every turn. I knew where the road dipped to cross the shallow ford at Miller's Creek. I knew where the old chestnut tree stood at the bend, the one that had been struck by lightning when I was 10, and split down the middle, but kept growing both halves, reaching for the sky like arms raised in surrender or prayer. I knew all of it, and knowing it, seeing it again after 2 years of brick walls and steam, produced a physical reaction in me that I was not prepared for. My throat tightened, my vision blurred. The landscape was reaching into me and finding the places where I had hidden the memories of it, pulling them up into the light. Then I saw the pines, or rather I saw where the pines had been. The northern edge of our property, the stand of white pine that had been there since before my grandfather was born, was ruined. A full third of the trees had been cut down. The stumps jutted from the earth in ragged rows, raw and white, still weeping sap where the saw had passed through them. The ground between the stumps was torn and rutted by the heavy wheels of logging wagons, the undergrowth crushed flat, the forest floor exposed and wounded. Sawdust lay in pale drifts among the wreckage. The air, which should have carried the clean, sharp scent of pine needles, smelled instead of raw wood and churned dirt, and something that was not a smell at all, but a feeling. Violation. Emmy made a small sound beside me, a sharp intake of breath that was almost a word, but not quite. I said nothing. I could not. The anger that moved through me was different from anything I had felt before. Different from the cold fury of discovering Briggs had stolen our wages. Different from the helpless rage of watching Dorothea sit in Grandpa's chair. This was something older and deeper. They had not just occupied our home. They had not just slept in our beds and eaten at our table. They had taken a saw to the living body of the land itself. They had sold pieces of it for cash pieces that had taken 100 years to grow, and they had done it on property that the law said was ours. Mr. Whitfield put his hand on my arm. Steady, Clara. We do this with law, not with anger. Anger is their territory. The law is ours. The buggy rounded the last bend and the house came into view. They were on the porch. Dorothea sat in a rocking chair that was not Grandpa's her own, brought from Knoxville, positioned at the center of the porch as if she were holding court. She wore a dress of dark blue cotton, and her hair was pulled back severely from her face, and she held a cup of tea in both hands. Franklin stood at the railing, and I noticed immediately that he had changed. He was thinner. The confident posture I remembered from 2 years ago, the speculator's swagger was gone. His shoulders were rounded, his face gaunt, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of debts unpaid and sleep unearned. The leather notebook was still in his hand. Some habits survive everything. They watched us approach. Dorothea's cup stopped halfway to her lips. Franklin's hand tightened on the railing. Neither of them moved. I stepped down from the buggy first. I stood on the ground of my grandfather's farm, my farm, and felt the red clay beneath my shoes, solid and real, and something locked into place inside me. Some gear that had been spinning loose for 2 years, finally catching and holding. Emmy came to stand beside me close enough that our shoulders touched. Behind us, Whitfield and Thomas descended with the measured calm of men who have done this before and know that the weight of the law is best carried quietly. I looked at Dorothea. I looked past her through the open front door into the hallway of the house where I had taken my first steps, where Grandpa had read to us by lamplight, where the smell of his coffee had filled the kitchen every morning of my childhood. I looked at the cottonwood trees along the creek, their leaves full and green in the June sun. I looked at the old swing frame still standing, though the ropes had rotted and the seat was gone. Then I looked back at my aunt, and I said the words I had been carrying across 50 miles of railroad track in 2 years of silence. "We have come home." Dorothea set her teacup down on the porch railing with a click that sounded very loud in the stillness. "What is the meaning of this? You were not invited here." Franklin moved toward the steps, positioning himself between us and the door. "This is private property. You are trespassing." I held out the documents. "No, Uncle Franklin, we are not." He snatched the papers from my hand, his movements quick and jerky, stripped of the smooth calculation I remembered. He scanned the first page, flipped to the second, and I watched his face change the way weather changes on a mountain, fast and violent, the color draining from his skin in a wave that started at his forehead and moved down. He looked at the third page, the deed itself, and then he did something I had not expected. He threw the papers on the ground. "Forgery," he said, his voice climbing. "The old man was not in his right mind when he signed this. I will take it to the county court. I will have it thrown out. This trust is fraudulent." Mr. Whitfield stepped forward and picked up the documents from the dirt. He brushed them clean with the same unhurried precision he applied to everything, and when he spoke, his voice was level and clear, each word placed with the care of a mason's setting stone. "Mr. Prescott, I drafted these documents myself in the presence of 2 witnesses, both of whom are alive and prepared to testify. The trust was notarized by a clerk of the county court and registered according to the full requirements of Tennessee law. It is as valid as the ground you are standing on." He paused, and then he turned to Thomas, who opened his satchel. "Furthermore, we have in our possession a sworn deposition documenting your visit to my office 6 months ago, during which you stated under the authority of your own signature that these 2 young women were deceased. That statement was false. You knew it was false when you made it. That constitutes fraud before an officer of the court, and it carries penalties that I suspect you would prefer to avoid." Franklin's mouth opened and closed. No sound came out. He looked at the deposition in Thomas's hand as if it were a living thing that might bite him. "I also have documentation," Whitfield continued, his voice never rising, "of a timber contract you executed with the Cumberland and Ohio Railroad Company for logging rights on the northern parcel of this property. A contract signed by you on land you do not own and have never owned. That contract is void. Any claims Cumberland and Ohio may wish to pursue will be directed at you personally, not at my clients." Franklin sat down on the porch steps. Not deliberately. His legs simply gave way beneath him, and he dropped the leather notebook, falling from his fingers and landing in the dirt at his feet. The fight went out of him all at once, like air leaving a punctured tire, and what remained was just a tired man in a rumpled suit, sitting on steps that did not belong to him, surrounded by the evidence of his own miscalculations. Dorothea had not moved from her chair. She had not spoken during Whitfield's recitation. She had sat perfectly still, her hands in her lap, now her teacup forgotten on the railing, and she had watched me. Not Whitfield, not Thomas, not the documents. Me. And when the silence that followed Franklin's collapse had stretched long enough to fill the yard and the fields beyond it, she spoke. He never forgave me. Her voice was different. The thin, imperious quality was gone. What came out was raw, stripped, the voice of someone who has been carrying a weight so long that the muscles have finally given out. I was his daughter, his only daughter. I nursed him when your grandmother died. I kept the house, I cooked the meals, I mended his clothes. And when I wanted to leave, when I wanted a life of my own, he looked at me as if I had committed a crime. Then your father died and he took you two in, and suddenly there was money for new fencing and a new roof and veterinary bills. And when I came to him and asked for help, asked him to sell a few acres so that Franklin and I could save our business, he refused. He chose this land over his own child. She was not performing. I could see that. The words were costing her something real, something she had held inside for decades, and now that the dam had broken, she could not stop the flood. Her eyes were wet, and her lips were trembling, and for the first time since I had known her, Dorothea Prescott looked like what she was, a woman in pain. I stood in the yard and listened. I did not feel pity. What I felt was more complicated than pity and more honest. I felt recognition. I understood in that moment that Dorothea had also been shaped by Samuel Wallace, carved by his silences and his choices, the same way Emmy and I had been carved by them, only in a different direction. She had loved him too in her way, and she had been hurt by him too in her way, and the bitterness of that hurt had calcified over the years into something that looked like greed but was really grief. It did not excuse what she had done. Nothing could excuse standing in a kitchen and telling two orphaned girls that they had nothing, that they belonged nowhere, that the only home they had ever known was no longer theirs. But it explained it. And understanding the wound does not mean forgiving the knife, but it does mean you can put the knife down. He did not choose us over you, I said. He chose to protect the land. It was the only way he knew how to love any of us. Dorothea looked at me. Something passed across her face, a flicker of surprise, as if she had expected anger and received instead something she did not have a name for. She did not respond. She turned her head and looked out at the fields, at the 70 acres that had been the source of so much love and so much damage, and whatever she saw there, she kept to herself. Mr. Whitfield gave them 1 week to vacate the premises. The house, he explained, had been included in the trust, along with the land held temporarily for Dorothea's use, only until the beneficiaries reached the age of majority. That time had passed. The house, like the land, belonged to Clara and Emmeline Wallace. We did not stay to watch them pack. We returned to Walden for the week, taking rooms at a small inn near the rail station, and I spent those days walking the town's quiet streets, thinking about what it means to win something back, and whether the thing you recover is ever the same as the thing you lost. I did not think it would be. I thought it would be something different, something that bore the marks of the losing and the finding, both the way a broken bone once healed is said to be stronger at the fracture line. On the 7th day, we drove back to the farm. They were gone. The porch was empty. The rocking chair Dorothea had brought from Knoxville was gone, with her leaving a rectangular mark on the wooden boards where it had sat, a small ghost of her presence that the weather would erase in a season. The yard was quiet. The barn door was open, swinging slightly in the breeze. And on the road, disappearing around the far bend, a buggy piled high with trunks and crates moved slowly away, trailing a thin cloud of red dust. We stood at the bottom of the lane, Emmy and I, and watched it go. They did not look back. Neither of them turned in the seat or raised a hand. They simply diminished, becoming smaller and smaller against the landscape, until the buggy rounded the curve and was gone, and the dust settled and the road was empty. But then, just before she passed out of sight, Dorothea's hand appeared from the side of the buggy and released something small. It arced through the air and landed in the dirt of the road with a faint metallic sound. I walked over and picked it up. The key to Grandpa's study. It lay in my palm, warm from her hand, a small brass key with teeth worn smooth by use. She had carried it for 2 years. She had locked that room on the day she arrived and kept it locked, and now she was giving it back. No words, no explanation. Just this small, heavy act of surrender tossed from a moving buggy into the dust. I closed my fingers around it and felt its weight, and I understood that this was the closest thing to an apology Dorothea Prescott would ever offer. We walked up the path together. We pushed open the front door. The house exhaled a stale breath, the accumulated atmosphere of 2 years of occupation without affection, scented with old perfume and cold fireplace ash, and the faint chemical tang of furniture polish, applied to surfaces that had never needed anything but a damp cloth and care. We moved through the rooms, methodically opening every window, every shutter, letting the warm June air flood through the hallways and bedrooms, and kitchen chasing out the last residue of strangers. I went to the study door. I put the key in the lock, turned it, and pushed the door open for the first time since the morning I had been dragged away from it by Franklin's cold voice. The room was smaller than I remembered. The desk was bare, the drawers pulled out and empty. Franklin had searched it thoroughly, looking for documents, for deeds, for anything that might confirm or deny the rumors of a second will. He had found nothing because everything of value had been in Whitfield's office for years. But on the wall above the desk, still hanging in its plain wooden frame, was a photograph. Sepia toned, slightly faded. Grandpa Samuel standing on the front porch, holding two small children, one on each arm. We were 3 years old in the picture, newly orphaned, and he was looking at the camera with an expression I had never fully understood until now. It was not grief. It was not duty. It was resolve. The calm, absolute determination of a man who has decided what he will protect and how far he will go to protect it. We stood on the back porch that evening, my sister and I, looking out at the 70 acres. The sun was dropping toward the ridgeline, and the light was doing what it does in East Tennessee in summer, turning everything to amber: the grass, the creek, the tree line, the air itself, as if the whole world had been dipped in honey. Emmy put her arm through mine and leaned against my shoulder. "Ours," she said. Her voice was clear and firm, a voice I had not heard from her since before Grandpa died, and the word landed between us with the weight of something that has been earned rather than given. The first year back was the hardest work either of us had ever done, harder even than the laundry, because the laundry had demanded only endurance, and the farm demanded everything. Endurance and intelligence and faith and the willingness to make mistakes and learn from them without anyone to guide you. The land had been neglected. The soil in the vegetable garden was compacted and starved. The barn roof leaked in 3 places. Fences were down along the west pasture. The chicken coop had collapsed entirely, and the hen yard was a tangle of rotted wood and weeds. But the work was different now. Every nail driven into the barn roof was not just a repair. It was a statement. Every fence post set and tamped was a claim staked. Every row turned in the garden was a line written in a language that Dorothea and Franklin and Harlan Briggs and everyone who had ever looked past us or through us could not read but could not deny. We are here. We belong here. We are not leaving. Emmy came alive on the farm the way a plant comes alive when you move it from a dark closet to a sunlit window. She had a gift with the animals that went beyond patience into something that looked almost like conversation. The first few head of cattle we bought with a small loan arranged by Mr. Whitfield followed her around the pasture like dogs, and she could tell by the way a cow held her head whether she was sick or frightened or simply annoyed. She named every animal on the property, including the chickens, which she introduced to me individually, with the seriousness of a hostess at a formal dinner. The first cow, a sturdy brown heifer with a white blaze on her forehead, she named Ida. I found my own strength in the planning, in the ledgers, in the crop rotations, in the calendar of seasons that governed everything from planting to harvest to the mending of fences before the first frost. I discovered that the years of keeping Briggs's stolen wages documented in my notebook had trained me for something I had not anticipated. I was good with numbers. I was good with systems. I could look at a field and see not just what it was, but what it could be, the way Grandpa had looked at a stand of timber, and seen not just trees, but the future they represented. I planted new pines on the northern edge in the scarred ground where Franklin's logging crews had done their damage. I dug the holes myself one by one, and set each seedling into the earth with my bare hands, pressing the soil around the roots, giving each one water from a bucket I carried from the creek. It was slow work. The trees would take decades to grow, but that was the point. I was not planting for this season. I was planning for a future I would grow old enough to see. Ida Crenshaw came to visit once in the late autumn of that first year. She arrived on the morning train and hired a buggy to the farm, and she walked the property in her good black dress and her sensible boots, looking at the new fence posts and the cleaned-out barn and the rows of winter cabbage in the garden and the young pines on the northern slope. She said very little. When she had seen everything, she stood on the front porch and looked out at the land and nodded once, a single sharp movement of her head. "Your grandfather would have been proud," she said. Then she returned to the buggy and went back to Millhaven, and I never saw her again in person. But every December, without fail, a package arrived by post wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Cornbread, still warm when I opened it, as if the distance between us were not 50 miles, but 50 steps. It was a morning in the following spring, the first true spring after our return, when I found the box. I was repairing the front porch steps, replacing boards that had rotted through during the years of neglect. I had pried up the third step from the bottom and was fitting a new board into place when my hammer struck something solid beneath the frame. Not wood, not stone, something else. I set the hammer down and reached into the gap. My fingers closed around a shape wrapped in oilcloth, compact and heavy, wedged into a hollow that had been deliberately carved into the support beam. I pulled it free and knelt on the porch, the spring sun warm on my back, and unwrapped it. A wooden box, small, no bigger than a cigar box, made of walnut, the grain smooth and dark with age. The lid was fitted tight but not locked. I lifted it. Inside, wrapped in a piece of soft cotton, were three things. The first was a letter, short, written in pencil on brown paper, the kind Grandpa used for wrapping parcels. The handwriting was hurried, the letters pressed hard into the surface, as if he had been writing against a deadline only he could see. "If you have found this, it means you have come home. I always knew you would. The land never forgets the ones who loved it. Remember that, Clara. Remember that, Emmy." The second thing was a hand-drawn map, ink on heavy paper folded twice. A map of the entire 70 acres, drawn with the precision and intimacy of a man who knew every contour of the ground the way he knew the lines on his own palms. Every feature was labeled in his careful hand. The spring on the eastern slope where the water ran cold and clean all year. The south-facing hillside where the soil was deepest and richest. The marshy ground along the lower creek that should be left wild for the herons and the wood ducks. The rocky outcrop on the western ridge where you could sit and see three counties. And in the bottom right corner, in letters slightly larger than the rest, as if he had wanted to make sure they would be legible, even after years of folding and unfolding, he had written for Clara and Emmy. Forever. The third thing was a small cloth bag tied with twine. I loosened the knot and poured the contents into my palm. Seeds. Acorns specifically. 4 of them smooth and brown, each one capped with its rough little hat. White oak acorns collected from the ancient tree that stood at the southwest corner of the property, the tree that had been old when Grandpa's grandfather was young. The tree he had always called the family tree, not because it recorded our lineage, but because it embodied it, a living thing that had stood in the same place for 2 centuries, growing slowly, putting down roots that nothing could reach. Emmy was in the barn when I called her. She came running, still holding a brush she had been using on one of the horses, and she knelt beside me on the porch, and we looked at the contents of the box together. She read the letter. She studied the map. She held the acorns in her cupped hands as if they were something infinitely fragile. And she looked at me with an expression that contained everything I felt but could not articulate. Gratitude and grief and wonder, and the strange, bittersweet understanding that the man who had loved us most had known us better than we had known ourselves. He had known we would come back. He had known we would find this box. He had planned for it the way he planned for the turning of seasons, with patience and foresight, and the unshakable conviction that the future, however distant, was worth preparing for. We planted the acorns that afternoon in the center of the property, on the gentle rise between the house and the creek where the ground was good and the sun fell unobstructed for the full length of the day. We dug 4 holes, 1 for each seed, and placed them into the earth with our bare hands, and covered them and watered them from the bucket Emmy carried from the creek. The trees would not be large in our lifetime. White oaks grow slowly, a few feet a year at most, putting their energy into roots before they bother with height, building their foundation in the dark before they reach for the light. But they would grow, and their roots would spread, and someday, decades from now, they would stand tall enough to be seen from the porch, 4 strong trees in a row marking the center of a piece of land that had been loved by every generation that touched it. That evening, I sat on the porch and wrote a letter to Ida Crenshaw. I told her about the box. I told her about the acorns. I told her that we had named the first cow after her, and that the cow was healthy and stubborn and gave excellent milk, which seemed appropriate. And I told her something I had never said to her face because She was not the kind of woman who would have tolerated hearing it in person. I told her that she had saved us, not with grand gestures or dramatic interventions, with cornbread and wool stockings left on a doorknob and a single sentence spoken over tea in a cold kitchen at midnight. She had taught me that survival is not a solitary act, that even the strongest roots need rain. The sun is going down now. I am standing on the porch, the same porch where my grandfather stood every morning of his life, and the light is doing what it has always done at this hour, laying itself across the land in long golden sheets, turning the pasture to copper and the creek to a ribbon of hammered bronze. The cattle are settling for the night, their dark shapes moving slowly through the grass toward the shade of the tree line. The chickens have gone to their coop, and their soft, contented clucking has faded into the stillness. The garden rows are neat and dark, the soil turned and planted, the first green shoots pushing up through the surface, reaching for the sun they have never seen, but somehow know is there. Emmy comes out and stands beside me. She leans her shoulder against mine the way she has done since we were children, and we do not speak. There is no need. We have said everything that needs to be said, and what remains is not words, but presence, the simple, irreducible fact of two people standing on ground that knows their names. I think about my grandfather, not with sadness anymore, not with the aching, hollow loss that defined those 2 years in Millhaven. I think about him with something that has no single word in any language. I know a feeling that lives at the intersection of gratitude and grief, and admiration and love, all of them woven together so tightly that you cannot pull one strand without disturbing the rest. He did not give us 70 acres of land. He gave us the understanding of what 70 acres means. He gave us the knowledge that a piece of ground is not a commodity or an investment or a line item on a speculator's ledger. It is a covenant, a promise between the people who work it and the earth that feeds them. And that promise, once truly understood, is unbreakable. He knew that Dorothea would take the house. He knew that Franklin would calculate and scheme. He knew that we would be cast out, that we would suffer, that we would spend years in a world that did not know us and did not care. And he allowed it. He allowed it because he understood something that took me 2 years of laundry steam and brick wall views and stolen wages and my sister's fever to learn. You cannot know the value of a home until you have lost one. You cannot understand what it means to belong until you have lived in a place where you do not. The losing was part of the gift. The winter was part of the harvest. The first stars are appearing now. One by one they come out faint at first, then brighter, taking their places in the darkening sky with the quiet confidence of things that have been doing this forever and will continue long after the people watching them are gone. The air has cooled, and it carries the smell of the field's grass and turned earth and the distant sweetness of the honeysuckle that grows along the fence line. Somewhere in the pasture a calf is calling for its mother, and the mother is answering, and the sound is old and simple and good. Emmy shifts beside me. She reaches into her pocket and takes out the dried chestnut, the one she took from Grandpa's coat pocket the day we were sent away. She has carried it for 2 years through every mile and every night and every fever dream. She holds it in the fading light, turns it over in her fingers, and then she places it on the porch railing, propping it against the post where Grandpa used to lean. "He is here," she says. I put my hand over the handkerchief in my pocket, the white cotton with the blue embroidered initials that has traveled with me from this porch to a laundry in Millhaven and back again, and I know she is right. They told me I had nothing. They told me the land was not mine, that I had no claim and no right and no place in the world except the one they chose to give me, which was no place at all. They were wrong. The land was always mine. Not because a piece of paper said so, though it did. Not because a lawyer confirmed it, though he did. The land was mine because I loved it, and because it remembered me, and because my grandfather, a quiet man who planted seeds in paper and in earth and in the hearts of 2 small girls, had trusted that love to bring me home. This is our land, this is our inheritance, and this time we know what it is worth.